Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the Scouse Science Podcast. My name is Tom Solomon. I'm here at the University of Liverpool, where I'm Professor of Neurology and Director of the UK's Emerging Infections Research Unit. My guests today are Eleanor Moritz and Tom Fletcher. Say hello, guys.
Hi.
Great.
Hello.
Thank you. Wonderful. First, a little bit of housekeeping. So welcome to all those who are listening to the podcast and watching. We usually have several hundred people, and we like you to join in. And you can join in a couple of ways. You can tweet. My Twitter thing is @RunningMadProf. You can tweet to the Scouse Science Podcast hashtag. And also you can chat with us using the chat function. And just to practice that, we'd like you now all to post in the chat function, telling us your name, where you're watching from, and whether this is your first time or whether you are a repeat offender. So if people would like to chat away in the chat function, that's good. And then you can also use it to post your questions or comments on anything you're hearing. We know thousands of people watch these on the Facebook, and you can similarly post into the Facebook telling us where you're from and whether you are a repeat offender or a first timer, and then also put your questions in there. And later on, my friend Holly Ellis will be joining us to feed in some of the questions and comments from the chat. Good. Now then, why do we do this Scouse Science Podcast? Well, I spend quite a bit of time talking about science on the television and radio. It's always a bit rushed, and it's clear that there's an appetite for people to have a little bit more time to chat, both about the science that's happening today, and then we also want to think about the wider impacts. So we have always a scientist with us, and also somebody from society to help us keep it grounded. And that today is the job of Eleanor Moritz. So let me introduce her. Welcome,
It's
Eleanor.
my job to keep you grounded, is it?
That's it. That's it. Now, you'll all know Eleanor from the fact that she's a regular producer and presenter on BBC Northwest TV breakfast bulletins, and in the past she's also done the evening news. And I've known her since we were teenagers, a long time. Was it? Can you remember the number of the bus that we used to both get?
The 41.
Exactly.
Of course.
It was a 41 bus. Now, after we were at school, two neighbouring schools in Manchester, and then after that, Ellie went to Leeds University, and subsequently, she did English, and then she did a postgraduate broadcast journalism at UCLan in Preston. Started at BBC Radio Lancashire in the 1980s, and started with BBC Northwest in 1994, and you've been there ever since.
That's right. Yeah, it's a very long time. So 32 years with the BBC now.
32 years.
Probably finding myself as the, if not one of the longest serving journalists in the Northwest Tonight newsroom now, particularly because obviously we've had a departure of a few old timers recently, such as Dave Guest, Stuart Flinders. So I think I'm probably the longest serving one left. Hesitate to say that categorically, but certainly amongst the longest one or two.
Does it feel like it to you that you've been there a long time, or does it still feel
I
fresh
still
as the first
feel
day?
16, Tom.
I bet you do. Now let's introduce our second guest, Tom Fletcher. Tom was also at the University of Leeds. Did you two know each other at Leeds?
When were you there? What years?
Oh gosh, 98 to 2003.
No, it's far too young for me.
I think, yeah. Well, I think you look younger. I unfortunately look a bit older, so that's where the confusion may have arisen.
I'm sure you'd be in the same year group. Tom did medicine there, did his PhD in tropical medicine here in Liverpool, and is now a consultant in infectious disease and tropical medicine, as well as being a member of the School of Tropical Medicine. And his research is on high consequence pathogens such as Ebola and now COVID. And he's worked on Ebola in West Africa, and also done a lot of work for the WHO. We'll come back to some of that later. And also, Tom, you didn't include this in your little brief bio for me, but I know this. You're a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Army Medical Corps. I am, yeah. So
I have a few different hats to wear.
It's not a secret. We are allowed to talk about that.
No, indeed.
Okay, good. Great. Well, thanks both for joining us. These are unusual times. I guess we'll start with Ellie. I mean, you've been at the BBC for all that time. Have you ever had anything that's come even remotely close to what's been happening in the last year? Maybe just terms of
No,
impact?
I mean, obviously, we're thinking about this in the run up to this podcast, and we've had stories which have dominated the news, haven't we? Such as, the Manchester Arena bombing and Hillsborough, which, Hillsborough on and off for years and years, but that was the thing. It was on and off in the sense that, in terms of dominating headlines, obviously there was it's always been there, and it is huge, and it always will be huge, and it will never go away. But in terms of leading news bulletins, we've had the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, then the inquiries and the inquests and the memorial services. But in between, there are times when it's not been at the top of the news. This is, I think, the pandemic, the only example that I can think of which has led the news, and not only led the news, but actually filled the news, filled entire programmes of the news on every channel for months and months and months and months. And for that reason alone, it's just been extraordinary and challenging in many, many ways for us. I mean, challenging logistically in terms of how we cover it and how we work, because like every other organisation, as a newsroom, we've had to think of socially distancing, which has meant far fewer people in the newsroom than we would normally have. We've had to think of different ways of filming things because we can't always go and see people depending on their circumstances, their health risk, what tier of restriction different areas of the Northwest have been in, the fact that we have, fewer resources and fewer staff because we're trying to socially distance. So interviews on Zoom and FaceTime and all of those things have become far more accepted, haven't they? And also, bizarrely, thinking about the technology, we've all terms are familiar with this, Tom, from your TV work, hiding technology. We love hiding technology, or we historically we have, haven't we? Because you mustn't see the microphone, or let's hide the wires and hide everything away. And now we find ourselves in a position where actually we have to get that shot to show that the reporter and the microphone are kind of at least 2 meters away from the person we're interviewing, because we have to demonstrate being socially distanced. So there's just so many different facets to covering this.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's so much to it. Let me come back to something you said right at the start. I mean, this has led the news, dominated the news, filled the news. Let me put this to Tom. Do you think it's been overdone in the news? Do you think it's been too dominant and, we could do with a few more breaks, as it were?
No, I guess I don't. I think I can understand that some people get a bit of COVID fatigue almost, don't they? That's all that we're hearing about. But given the impact that it's had on every part of our society, clearly as a healthcare worker in the NHS too, but just for every part, then I think it's inevitable that it's going to lead virtually every news story. And I think the story has changed so much from the beginning through to now, and every different part of through vaccines, through testing. And the pressure on the NHS, it's just rolled from one story to the next, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of following it.
Am I the only person who, when we had other big stories like when Brexit really hit the headlines, I was kind of thank God for Brexit, because at least it gives us a little bit of a break, and the Trump escapades in America. But maybe that's partly because when there are big stories, I have been pulled into them a little bit and done a little bit of that. And Tom, you've done a bit of that as well, haven't you, talking to the media? How's your experience of that been?
So yeah, more at the beginning, I think, as we were saying before, that I think when people really didn't know anything about COVID or the virus that emerged in China, and having worked then for WHO at the beginning of the outbreak again, then I spoke to a few different people about it on various media outlets. But I think, and that's been an important part, I think, of the story so far, that actually people have wanted to hear from scientists and from clinicians who are managing cases, as opposed to just the government briefings. And I think that's important for trying to bring our communities with us and engage them so that they understand more about the pandemic.
Do you think we've
I think the buzz phrase, just to interrupt Tom, from many points of view, has been news you can use, hasn't it? Because with the pandemic, because all along it's been the developments and the nuances and the different changes and the restrictions, and then the first wave and the second wave, and what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and in different areas. But because this has been quite hard to follow, this hasn't just been about reporting it, has it? It's been about getting people who know, whether it's the scientists or the politicians who are making decisions at local level, to actually explain it and repeat it so that the messages just get home all the time, because people do get confused, and people were finding the restrictions, particularly with different areas, when it even got down to a micro level of which council ward you're in at one point. And it was very much to do with, you know, this is what today's restrictions or this week's restrictions are. This is what they mean for you at home.
Have you felt more responsibility in that sense? Like you said, this is news. You said news you can use. In other words, these are things people absolutely have to know. Normally in life, you can merrily bobble along. You can listen to the news if you want, or not if you don't. But have you felt a greater responsibility on that account?
Absolutely. And I think the other Tom mentioned coronavirus fatigue from some degree, and I think we've perhaps all been guilty of that a little bit, much as, you know, we don't want to you know, do the importance of this pandemic down. But from our point of view, we have to remember that although things become repetitive, and we might think to ourselves when preparing a news bulletin or a program, oh, you know, do we really need to repeat what the rules are in tier 2 and tier 3 and tier 1 again? We did it 2 days ago. Yes, we do, because somebody might not have seen the bulletin, might not have seen the program, or might not have taken that information in. So very much so, yes, it's not just about reporting what changes there are and what new things there are, but going over old ground and just repeating and making sure that people understand how the situation affects them at home.
Great. Let me just remind people, I know everyone's taking in and listening very carefully to what we're saying. Do post any questions or comments or thoughts in any of the chat options, whether you think perhaps we have been overdoing it, have Ellie and her team been overdoing it and not giving us enough of a break, or perhaps we should have had more coverage of these things. What have you, you know, over the past year, what have you managed to cover that maybe has given a little bit of a break in terms of your bulletins?
Well, very little, Tom. I mean, because it has been so pandemic dominated. But I think the thing we try to do on Northwest Tonight, and I think many news outlets have as well, is along the way we've tried to find the uplifting stories, haven't we? Because amongst all the doom and gloom and you know, the tragedies of the deaths and the human stories of the people that we've lost, we've also tried to find those positive stories, haven't we? The kind of rainbows in the windows that we saw, the clap for carers that we saw earlier on, and the community cohesion and the social action and all of those good elements that have come out of this. And there have been many good elements as well that have come out of the pandemic. And I think we have tried to kind of show those, whether it was, you know, video posted on social media from a community in Fletcher who started fairly early on, I think, doing dances in the street to a physical trainer, to the same song every day, but they loved it. And it was kind of inspiring in some way to see them coming out and doing this, and all of those kind of little stories along the way which give us some kind of positive light. You know, the care home where, I don't know if you remember the carer who had a cushion made for one of her residents with a picture of his late wife printed on the cushion to give to him to cuddle, because he'd kind of missed that touch and then he'd missed his wife so much. So it's those uplifting moments as well, isn't it? I mean, no, we haven't had many other stories to cover. It's trying to find the other angles of the story, I think.
Tom, did any of your carers make a cushion for you in case you were missing them?
No, I got no cushions. But I think on that last point Nelly was mentioning, I think we have to have light at the end of the tunnel here, and you know, everyone has to see that we're moving forward, and some of that is with the scientific advances we're making and improved understanding of how to combat this pandemic. But I think everyone just has to see the end, the light at the end of the tunnel. I sort of think that for a community who's going through this too, but also for patients. I know that when we have patients who are critically unwell, who are often on this CPAP type mask that no one likes wearing, I frequently say to them, this is not forever. This is just get through another session, get through another day of this mask, and you're a day closer to getting off CPAP and a day closer to getting home. And that's sort of what I think as a society, things are moving, and every day is hopefully a day closer to getting somewhere near normal.
You've got your theatre blues on, your scrubs on, and I know you've been in the hospital today. Tell us how are things there at the moment?
Well, fortunately, a bit better. I think matching the reduced transmission in Liverpool here, the hospital now has less cases in. I think during the peak that we had a couple of months ago, we had 450 cases across both sites of confirmed coronavirus. So actually more than the first wave. And at one stage, we were the busiest hospital in Europe with cases. But fortunately, as a result of some of the implemented measures and we've now down to about 3 or 4 wards in the Royal Liverpool Hospital now. So fortunately, my ward has actually flipped for the first time in a long time from being a COVID red ward to actually a normal infectious diseases ward, which is quite welcome.
So it's just all the other normal infectious diseases.
We've got some unusual cases in there too to keep us interested, but yes, just normal infectious diseases is welcome.
And of course,
that's really encouraging to hear.
Go on, Ellie, carry on. Are you pleased to? Obviously, everyone's pleased. What did you make of the fact, Ellie?
That's really encouraging to hear. I was just wondering. I was just wondering. Sorry to interrupt. I was just wondering, Tom, or either Tom, how much of a part you think that the mass testing has played in that? Because obviously, Liverpool for us actually has become the national story over the last month. Because you mentioned the hospital occupancy rates there, and it was at one point kind of the worst in the country, and you've shown significant improvements, and actually you found Liverpool becoming the focus of national news over the last 3-4 weeks as it became the national hub for this pilot and mass testing. So I just wondered, from the scientific point of view, how much of a part you thought that had played in this.
I think I'll go first. I mean, Tom can comment in a second. Firstly, I think you're right. It's nice to be at the centre of the story for a positive reason than for being having the most cases. And things that, definitely, I think we're the only place that went up a tier or improved in terms of the tier after the lockdown. And I think there's no doubt the mass testing contributed to that. We were, of course, in tier 3 before the lockdown. And I think that helped as well. But the mass testing has identified several thousand people who have then been isolated. And I think, although we know some people are struggling to isolate when they are a contact of somebody and people are finding that difficult, I think most people, when they know they're actually positive themselves, then they are much more inclined to isolate. So I've no doubt that even in the news today, we heard it's not brilliant, the testing, it's not as accurate as some of the other formal testing. But as long as it actually identifies some people who are then isolated, who otherwise would not have been, then I think it's a useful contribution. Tom, what do you think?
Me too. I'd follow that. I think it was nice, as you say, for once to feel like we were getting in front of it. So from the first time this really hit with waves in London, I remember speaking to colleagues in hospitals there who just said, we've constantly felt behind this virus, a few days behind where we needed to be in the hospital with a public health response. And we therefore have to be bold and take a bit of risk to try and get in front of this and introduce new innovation. In terms of the impact it had, I think that there are certainly a lot of signals that it had a positive effect. And I think what we don't need to do is probably consider it the panacea. I think everyone, from working in many outbreaks before, there's many different tools that we need to get in place, and this may well be a very valuable tool. It's not going to absolutely stop transmission. It's not going to be the key thing that ends the pandemic, but as part of a sort of suite of things that we can bring out and help stop it, it looks to be useful, and I think most people agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Now, lights at the end of the tunnel. There's, of course, a big light that has appeared at the end of the tunnel, which we will come on to shortly. But I'm going to, at this point, Holly Ellis, who's my pal, who is a Scouse scientist, is going to join us and just tell us what the chat has been on the chat, and also put any questions that people have had from there. So, Holly, hi, how are you doing?
Hi Tom, yeah, I'm good, thanks. We've had a lot of comments from different people, including your Auntie Judy, to tell us that she's also watching again this week. And one of the questions has come from Julia on Facebook, and she said, people are craving good and positive news at the minute. And Tom Solomon, she saw you on Facebook with your little dog talking about a charity appeal, and she's asking what was all of that about.
Yes, right. Well, I will talk about that. That was who did that come from? That question, did you say?
That was from Julia Clark on Facebook.
Julia, great, thank you, Julia. So yeah, I have been. I work for a charity called the Encephalitis Society, and we are doing our Christmas appeal and raising money. So I mean, interestingly, encephalitis is inflammation and swelling of the brain, and as this COVID pandemic has gone on, it's clear that the virus does affect the brain and does cause brain problems. So the charity has been terribly busy. We are fundraising. I'm using this as a shameless plug to say to people, if you do want to support the work we're doing, we'll post a link. But if you do want to support it, then please get in touch and donate. And part of the problem for me is they're doing something terrible called the 12 Days of Tom, where they're tweeting an embarrassing tweet relating to me every day. And I think the idea is if they persist, I'll get enough people to contribute some money, and maybe they'll stop doing it. But anyway, what other comments have you had?
Yes, so we've had another question that, Eleanor, this might be a good one for you to answer. This is from Susan O'Halloran on Zoom, and she's saying it would be good and interesting to hear about how countries with fewer resources are coping in this situation, but then she's also put, or perhaps would that cause too much worry and more upset for people, especially with those who've got families overseas?
Well, I mean, clearly, as somebody who covers news in the Northwest, I would first say I'm not able to organise that, but I actually think that it's a really valid point, and I personally think we should be seeing how other countries are coping, and this is a big question now with the vaccine, isn't it, Tom? In terms of how accessible that vaccine is going to be to those countries, and it may be a worry for people with relatives there, but actually I think we all have a social responsibility, not just for our own county, our own region, our own country, but we have a social responsibility to see how countries around the world are dealing with this. And in terms of the vaccine, I'd love to get both of your thoughts really on the rollout of the vaccine, both in this country and globally, because that is going to be a big issue, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll come to that in a sec. Let's just, Holly, do you have anything else before we let you go?
Yeah, so just a couple more questions. Louise Ellman on Zoom has said that COVID's brought a new understanding and appreciation of the importance of scientists and researchers, and how can we develop this in the future? So I guess doing things like this, the podcast, is one way that we're probably doing that already, isn't it?
What do you think, Tom, in answer to that question? How can scientists engage the public more? And do you think we've been doing a good job of it up till now?
I think it's probably a question I could put back to you, Tom, as I think it's mainly about how we communicate with people. And I think not everybody who's a scientist necessarily has that ability to communicate with non-scientists and the sort of the general public. But as what I would hope is a trusted sort of voice, it's really important that we do engage. And I think you could maybe give a few tips to others in terms of speaking to the press or general public a lot too, Tom, in terms of how the best way to do that is.
Thank you.
It goes back to the news you can use. It goes back to explaining it in terms that everybody can understand, doesn't it? It's avoiding jargon. It's not shying away from the science, but it's about communicating it in a way which is understandable by absolutely everybody, which we all have a mission to do, don't we?
I think so, and I think probably we don't educate ourselves or scientists enough. You know, is it part of the medical school curriculum at the moment here in Liverpool to science communication? As someone who's partly responsible for the medical school curriculum, but it's the sort of thing we should take on, I think, and I suspect there will be more of this in the future. Holly, anything else before we let you go and see what else is coming in?
There's some people that are saying they're a bit confused with all the changes of the rules, which I can kind of understand, because the change, and they've made the tiers and now they changed what the tiers mean, and they're just saying they're kind of a bit fed up with it all and given up trying to understand what's going on now. So there's a bit of frustration, I think, with everyone on that front.
I think we can probably all share that. It's I mean, it is difficult and confusing, and the only way you can know is you have to always go to the source material, which is the Gov.uk website. Even then, it's sometimes not completely clear. But I think,
or the BBC, of course.
Yeah, well, the BBC they digest the Gov.uk websites, but they don't have everything on there, obviously, because you're pulling out the most important things. But there are things that you wouldn't know unless you specifically look, because some of it's quite nuanced. And even then, some of it is not completely clear. The business lunch has been a bit of a controversial example. All right, Holly, we'll let you go. We're going to move on and talk about vaccines. We'll catch up with you a little bit later on.
Okay, great.
Thanks. See you in a bit. Actually, before we talk about vaccines, let's just pick up on this question in relation to the overseas aspect. Clearly, Northwest Tonight focuses on the Northwest, but it does bring in the overseas element when it talks about some of the overseas research being done at the University of Liverpool and at the School of Tropical Medicine. And Tom, you've spent a lot of time overseas working, for example, on Ebola. Tell me, how does this response, for example, in the Northwest to this problem compare to your experiences of Ebola in West Africa in terms of how society is responding?
Gosh, that's quite a big question. I think it's unusual, isn't it? Because my normal reason d'etre is leaving the UK to go and work in outbreaks overseas. I never really imagined that I'd be managing one, at home in my own hospital of this scale. So I think going back to a point that I think Ellie made before is that what we want is equity of access to these interventions. So if we develop a new vaccine, if we have a new treatment or a new test, what we want, and I think the UK has really led with that to a degree, is ensuring that those scientific advances are available to the most vulnerable communities. And I think from the very beginning, we knew that some of those communities overseas, when challenged by a big wave of COVID, would be extremely vulnerable to having a lot of excess deaths. And that was our major worry. Some of that hasn't borne out really across some of the most vulnerable countries in Africa. South Africa was particularly hardly hit, as you know. And whether those waves are still coming is unclear. But I think bringing it back to home in the Northwest, thinking about the mass asymptomatic testing, I think one of the clear successes that maybe hasn't come out yet was that intervention managed to access the more vulnerable populations in Liverpool, so the poorer wards, by really careful planning with, I think, the council and the public health department to put the testing centres in a sort of a short space of walk for 80+% of the population. So previously, I think, people with a car who with higher sort of wealth and socioeconomic status could drive out to the testing centres, but the vulnerable sort of poorer populations couldn't do that. So I think that has probably been a great success, demonstrating that bringing testing close to the community works.
Yeah, although there were questions raised recently, I think, about the take-up in those more deprived areas, I think. So still, even though you can kind of metaphorically take the horse to the water, you can't necessarily make it drink. It's that whole situation, isn't it? But certainly those efforts were much needed and need to continue.
Yeah, I think you're right. The take-up was greater in those areas because it was taken to the front door, as it were. But it's still not quite as high as in some of the other areas. And of course, this leads into questions about the vaccines which are coming and how well they will be implemented. What's your take on the vaccine story been, Ellie? Are you I'm
quite fascinated by it, actually, Tom, because it is the great light at the end of the tunnel, as it were, I think, and you're almost, some of us are almost scared to pin hopes onto it, and there are many questions. Is it the end? Is this the beginning of the end? But then when you think more deeply about it, as I have been, there are other questions, such as, unless I've missed it, has it been explained, for example, whether people will only need this 2 doses, my understanding, but do you need just the 2 doses, or is this going to become like the flu vaccine, where we perhaps need to get a different one every year if the virus mutates? Those kind of questions. And the other thing which I find really interesting is that every other vaccine that we've come across, whether it's measles, rubella, the flu jab, whatever, you're just kind of aware that you book an appointment and you go for a jab. This is the only example I can think of as somebody who's a non-scientist, where we've actually become aware of the different manufacturers. And we're aware that we've got, you know, the Oxford vaccine and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna one, and they're all kind of, perhaps some people may say they're competing, but the fact is we're all aware of these different manufacturers and the different ways in which these have been developed. So then that gives rise to questions as to, so as this saga unravels and the vaccine rolls out, should people get a choice in which vaccine they go for, or are they just given one? I mean, you know, that kind of opens different kind of issues, doesn't it?
Tom, what are your thoughts on those questions?
Gosh,
take any or all.
Yeah, okay. I mean, they're key questions, aren't they? And I think some of them we have to be honest and say that we don't know just yet. I think the first thing, you know, as people are looking for that light, it is a big thing. You know, 10 months into the outbreak, then to have a licensed vaccine available for use is remarkable. I think what we should remember, though, is that this is built on a foundation of research for decades beforehand. So you're right that it was rapidly accelerated and funded during this outbreak, but the work done by Moderna, by Pfizer, by University of Oxford is built on a foundation of other vaccine work. But in terms of how long it lasts, we don't know. So WHO sort of set the standard of let's have 70% efficacy and let's have lasting protection for a year. But we know that some coronavirus immunity doesn't last all that long. I'm going to have to see, you know, as they follow out vaccine participants and as we see it introduced, how long that lasts for. And I think, as you mentioned, Ellie, we just got to be aware of mutations and other viral shift that could impact both testing and therapeutics and the vaccine too. So that's obviously ongoing surveillance work that people are doing. But we have to grab the positive when it happens and say, brilliant, amazing news. I mean, if you think that 75% of I think our deaths are in the over 75s, and we now have a tool to offer to that most vulnerable population, including in care homes, hopefully, very quickly to try and protect them from COVID. It's great.
Yeah, I would endorse much of that. It's new, so we don't know how long it will last for. If you want my guess, based on what we know about these types of viruses, I don't think this will be a jab for life. You know, yellow fever jab protects you for life pretty well. But what we don't know is, we basically don't know how long immunity will last. But it's more than just how long it lasts, because if most of the population have been vaccinated, then the virus will go down a lot, even if it doesn't disappear. So I think there's a lot of factors that will play in. What you said about this is the first time the public has taken an interest in the type of vaccine. There is one other example of that, actually, which is whether people take their measles jab on its own or whether they take it as part of the measles, mumps, rubella, MMR, which was the only time, again, where people really started thinking about the specifics. And of course, you know, we know how badly that worked out, in the sense that at one stage there was some fraudulent research published that suggested MMR vaccine was linked to autism. It was being completely discredited, and the person that led that research was struck off. But that did not stop a wave of fear about vaccines, which carries on to this day in the form of two things, I would say: reasonable doubt and people being uncertain. And I think we're all fine with that, and it's our job to then convince them that the vaccines are safe. But also at the other extreme, anti-vaxxers who are just set on an agenda, which again, I think is a fraudulent agenda just to stop people getting vaccinated. Does the BBC feel a sense of responsibility about how it reports these kind of issues, Ellie?
Well, very much so. And it's the kind of issue, unfortunately, where we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, because whichever side we are reporting, we get flack from the other side. There are some issues that are just like that. But you know, nevertheless, there have been anti-vaccine demonstrations in the Northwest, as you're probably aware, and we've carried pictures of those and reported those, and we've perhaps had some flack when we've done that. But you know, similarly, we have to show an event that is happening on a large scale. And the development of the vaccine, though, I think is potentially, you know, the game changer, isn't it, in this pandemic? And let's hope that the rollout, which will be something that we will have to report the logistical difficulties or challenges of over the next few weeks, will be something to see in the news over the next month, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the logistics is all happening now, isn't it? I think the hopes are for the first vaccinations to begin next week. I think, Tom, go on.
Sorry, no, just to add, I think undoubtedly we will get hold of adequate stocks of vaccine. We will have the logistics to be able to implement that across the NHS, which is, a remarkable thing when you compare it to other countries, the infrastructure that we have. What concerns me most is this previous story, and this is why I think this communication and this mobilizing, our social mobilization, bringing communities with us is so important, because there will be a challenge from these, let's be honest, frankly, a lot of crazy anti-vaxxers, because of the work that's gone on before. And we have to challenge that and really engage with our communities to understand why we're doing it. The problem with this is that everyone has a choice and they can decide, I don't want to have this vaccine. But the problem is you then present risk to others who aren't eligible, who are vulnerable. By the way, this virus transmits so easily. So whilst you might take a personal choice not to wear a mask, not to socially distance, not to have the vaccine, I struggle with that too, to be honest, clearly. But if you then present a risk to a vulnerable person who hasn't made that choice, hasn't had that vaccine, and then they end up critically unwell or dying, it's a real problem for me. And that's why it's so important that we communicate well and are open and honest about the results and these vaccines that are coming forward.
Freedom of choice, though, is critical, isn't it, in our country, and has always been enabled with things like vaccines, whereas I'm aware that some countries, I think, penalise people for not having certain vaccinations. I mean, do you ever see that becoming something that could be introduced here?
I did. So I was on the BBC Moral Maze, and I was on that programme a couple of weeks ago on Radio 4, where we were discussing this exact issue. And I think it's unlikely that it will be needed in this country. I think there will be a strong anti-vax lobby. But I think most people who need to get vaccinated will get vaccinated. But I think people have genuine concerns about a vaccine which is newly produced. It was a friend of mine's mother, actually, I think, who's 80 plus, and he said to me that she had said to him, "Oh, this vaccine, it's been produced very quickly, hasn't it?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, well, I wonder about, has there been any shortcuts?" And he said, "Yeah, but Mum, you will take it, won't you?" And she said, "Of course I will." And I think that'll be the majority will realise that it's going to save lives, and they will take it. But if,
I think the thing with corona,
Ellie's frozen for me.
This virus in this pandemic has been that of some of the illnesses and deaths that we've seen in our hospitals has been so. On such a level and so tragic, and affected so many families, and it's very close to home to many, many, many people. And I think that will go a long way to persuading some people who may have doubts.
Great. Well, let's get Holly back in. I think there's been quite a lot of discussion on the chat function on Facebook and also on Zoom here. Holly, what are the public going to do? Are they going to get vaccinated or not?
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know about everyone, but you're right, there's a lot of anxiety surrounding the actual vaccine. And whilst people do seem to be pleased that a vaccine is now in place or will be shortly, there's a lot of worry and concern because it's being pushed through so quickly. One question from Eddie Spofford on Facebook is asking about what are the long-term effects of the RNA vaccine and what measures, if any, are in place to combat these should they happen.
Tom, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's this sort of concern that people have that we're using RNA, so a bit of the genetic material from the virus, and can that then interfere with our DNA? Is that going to affect our DNA, increase our risk of cancer? But these are small proteins that are introduced and generate a sort of an immune response in the body where it recognizes the type of virus. It has no ability to integrate itself into our DNA. And I think the other key thing that we have to have a bit of trust in is the MHRA. So our health and medicines regulatory authority is world leading. And, you know, the rigor that they go through data before approving it for use is exemplary. And I think it has been fast, but I think that reflects the organization and the hard work of that organization. It's certainly not any corners that have been cut.
Thanks, Ellie. What's next? Ellie, what's next? Holly, what's next?
That I think answers his question. And again, there's more questions about the approval process and how has it been rushed, like you've already discussed, but also the fact that because this has been put through so quickly now, does that mean that we can change and in the future, you know, other things will be able to be approved so quickly as well?
Maybe I'll take that one. Firstly, has it been rushed? No, I sit on the MHRA expert working group that's looked at these vaccines. I still do. And it's not been rushed. It's just happened quicker because we've spent days, nights, evenings, weekends, round the clock assessing all the data as it's come in, which normally would be assessed over months. It's just we've worked harder and quicker. And I think I draw the analogy, there's a few analogies I've tried to draw. I'm not sure any of them work, but for me, it's a bit like getting on a plane at the airport. People who have a business class ticket get through the queues quicker, they get to the plane quicker, but they've had just all the same security checks as everybody else. It's all just happened a bit quicker. So impact on future vaccines. I mean, I think it has shown, we had this with Ebola as well, that that was really the first one where people said, you can't have a situation where it takes 10 years to make a vaccine. We have to be quicker and smarter. And Ebola started the ball. And I think now with COVID, we've really shown how it can be done. So I think it will happen quicker for future occasions when it's needed. But there is a bit of a backlog now of some of the other things that haven't been through so quickly. So we'll have to allow for that, I think. One more question, Holly.
Okay, so there's this guy, Jordan Dickens, that's asked a few questions on Zoom, and he's really concerned because I feel like he wants the vaccine, but he doesn't agree with the ethical history of some of the pharmaceutical companies that are producing this vaccine, and what can he do to relieve his concerns around this?
Let's actually get Ellie's thoughts on that. This is, you know, some people have a feeling against any big pharmaceutical companies or any big organisations at all. How do you think people like that? I mean,
you know, this isn't obviously as objective, impartial journalist, I'm not going to start getting involved in discussions on the ethics of pharmaceutical companies. But it does go back to what I said, Tom, earlier, is that this is the first example. I mean, you mentioned MMR and the choice that people have, but that was just in terms of how they took the vaccine. But it goes back to what I was saying, was that this is the first example I can think of where we, the public, the patients, the customers, the people who are actually going to get this vaccine, have actually been aware of every nuance and the manufacturer's names and who has made these vaccines and how they've been developed and what's in them. And I think that's the issue which we're perhaps some people are feeling uncomfortable with, if you like, because it's not being presented to them as here's the flu jab, here's a rubella jab. It's okay, so there's this one and it's made by this company and this is what's in it and this is the work that's gone on into it and this is how it's been tried. We've never been exposed to that before. I think that's the issue that is making people feel uncomfortable, but then raising important questions.
Yeah. I guess that's the thing, isn't it? Previously, people have just, the jab was there, take it or not. Nobody's had to make decisions, and people will be wanting to make decisions about, do they go for this vaccine which is now available, or others will say, well, I'd rather hold on till the Oxford one comes through because that's using more established technologies. There'll be issues actually around whether people who've had one vaccine then might have a different one. I think that there's a lot of scientific issues, but I think you're right. The broader society issue is really interesting, that it's the first time people have been faced with these kind of considerations. Probably a good thing. I mean, maybe people should take more of an interest in the drugs and medicines and vaccines that they take. Tom, you're nodding.
No, just to say, yeah, I completely agree. But I think the most important thing, and seeing some of the chat come up as well, is just that transparent sharing of information. So some people will not feel like they need much. They have trust, and actually, I'm going to go with this. I know what a mess our society's in, and I believe in the authorities who support it. Others will want more information. And what they have to have then is the forum where they can access that and make that informed choice about whether they'll uptake the vaccine.
Do you think we should be putting all the, the MHRA, all the information we review, putting all that out there for people to, a bit like, some of the meeting minutes of SAGE and some of the other committees have been put out there? Would that really benefit society, or actually would those that are looking for a conspiracy agenda would find things written in there that they maybe don't fully understand, but which they then push out there and say, look, on this day it caused this symptom to this person? Do you think you can have too much information?
I might pass that to Ellie to answer first off, in terms of what do you think in terms of that balance?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? And I just think you were talking earlier, weren't you, Tom, about the fact that this is perhaps setting the bar for future vaccines in terms of the speed of their development. Perhaps this is also setting the bar in terms of the amount of information that the public will feel they have a right to expect in future in terms of the development of different medications, drugs, vaccinations, etc. Because after all, patients are, as I said before, the customers, aren't we, of the NHS?
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that's actually a very good point for us to end on. We're told not to go beyond 45 minutes, and we've gone over slightly. I've posted in the chat two things. One is the website for the Encephalitis Society charity, who are fundraising, and who I'm the president of the society. Please support us if you feel so inclined. I've also put in the chat the details of the podcast. So all previous episodes, and indeed this one, will be available as an audio podcast in all the usual places where you find podcasts, or you can look at the live video streams of previous episodes via Facebook. So it just time now for me to thank the people who have helped with this. Firstly, the behind the scenes team, Jen, Chris, Claire, Sean, Amelia, Jamie, who does some of the technical stuff. And then also to thank our team today, Holly, Eleanor and Tom. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.
Bye.